The dog refused to leave the third-floor window, and the man who'd survived war suddenly stopped trusting the silence. Rain hammered the broken roof as Grant shoved the swollen front door open, but Atlas froze on the threshold, staring into the darkness above. A floorboard creaked where no one stood. The old lantern hanging in the tower swayed once, though the air inside was perfectly still. Grant tightened his grip without taking another step because his partner had never been wrong before. Then Atlas let out a low growl that echoed through the empty house. What do you think Atlas sensed first? The rain had started before sunset and showed no intention of stopping. It droomed against the roof of the faded blue pickup parked beneath a row of cottonwoods outside the public library in Elk Ridge, Wyoming. Water crept down the windshield in slow silver ribbons, bending the yellow glow of the streetlights into wavering lines that reminded Grant Mercer of tracer rounds disappearing into desert darkness. He opened his eyes before the memory finished forming. The inside of the truck was cold enough that every breath hung in the air. Beside him, Atlas lifted his head from the worn army blanket spread across the passenger seat. The German Shepherd's amber eyes searched Grant's face first, not the window. They always did. Is greater than. Is greater than. I'm herein. Is greater than. Is greater than. Grant murmured. Is greater than. Is greater than. Relax. Is greater than. Is greater than. The dog relaxed, without making. 45 years old. Former Army Ranger. 4 deployments in Afghanistan. 2 Bronze Stars. 1 Purple Heart. None of it had mattered when the medical bills arrived after his second spinal surgery. The house had gone first, then the savings, then the job repairing logging equipment outside Cody. For nearly 7 months, the pickup had become the closest thing either of them had to home. Grant reached into the cooler behind the seat. Half a bottle of water, 2 slices of bread, 1 can of beans. He divided the bread in half. Atlas waited until Grant nodded before taking his share. Old habits, military habits. The strongest ate last. Outside, thunder rolled over the mountains. Grant glanced toward the library doors. They would stay open another 45 minutes. Warmth was reason enough. He pulled his faded ranger jacket tighter and stepped into the rain. The library smelled of old paper, coffee, and dry heat. Grant liked libraries because nobody asked questions if you kept quiet. Atlas settled near the fireplace, drawing curious smiles from an elderly couple reading newspapers. A little girl whispered to her grandmother that the dog looked like a wolf. Grant almost smiled. Almost. He wandered toward the community bulletin board near the entrance. Missing cats, church suppers, a volunteer fire department fundraiser. Then one white sheet caught his eye. County tax property auction Thursday. 10:00 a.m. Old Courthouse Annex. Among dozens of parcel numbers, one listing stood alone. Parcel 17 to 442, former Holloway Estate. Minimum opening bid, $15. Grant frowned. $15. Even condemned land brought more than that. He tore off one of the information tabs without quite knowing why. Atlas appeared beside him. The dog stared at the paper, then gave a quiet huff. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" Grant asked. Atlas blinked. Grant folded the paper into his pocket. The courthouse annex smelled of wet wool and burnt coffee. About 30 people filled the folding chairs. Developers, land investors, farm owners, men who attended auctions because buying forgotten things had become a profession. Grant sat in the last row. His backpack rested between his boots. Atlas lay quietly beside him, wearing the faded service vest he had worn overseas. People noticed. Some looked away. Others whispered. The auction moved quickly. Old barns, flooded cabins, flooded vacant lots. Then the auctioneer adjusted his glasses. Parcel 17442. A few people chuckled before he finished. The Holloway house. Someone near the front laughed outright. Still haunted? Another answered, depends who you ask. More laughter followed. The auctioneer waited for it to die. Opening bid. He looked down. $15. Silence. Nobody lifted a paddle. Grant studied the photograph projected behind the podium. A large Victorian house stood alone against pine-covered hills. 3 stories. Stone, foundation, wide front porch. Most windows boarded. The paint had faded nearly white, but the roofline looked straight. No major sag, no collapse. Old shingles still holding. Grant had learned long ago to ignore appearances. Whether inspecting villages overseas or abandoned buildings back home, the bones always mattered more than the skin. He raised his hand. I've got 15. Every head turned. The room erupted in laughter. One man, in an expensive hunting jacket, twisted around in his chair. Buddy, he said, grinning. That place eats people, another added. Hope your ghost likes company. Grant didn't answer. The auctioneer blinked twice. $15 once. No one countered. Twice. Still nothing. The gavel struck. Sold. Grant walked quietly to the clerk's desk. He counted out 10, 5, 3 singles, 2 crumpled ones. Every dollar he owned except the bus fare folded inside his wallet. The young clerk hesitated before handing over the old brass key. You know the stories. Grant slipped the key into his pocket. I know it'll keep the snow off. The clerk stared. Grant gave the smallest shrug. Still keeps the snow out. The road climbed higher into the mountains until pavement surrendered to cracked asphalt. Fog drifted through tall pines. The afternoon sky hung low and gray. When the house finally appeared above the trees, even Grant slowed the truck. It stood on the ridge like something forgotten by time. The wraparound porch leaned slightly. Wild vines swallowed half the stone chimney. Broken shutters knocked softly in the wind. The round tower reached above the roofline. Its highest window, the only pane not covered by weathered boards. Grant shut off the engine. Silence settled over the mountain. He climbed out. Atlas didn't. The German shepherd remained perfectly still. Not frightened. Watching. His ears locked forward. His muscles tightened. His eyes never left the 3rd floor tower window. A low growl vibrated deep inside his chest. Not loud, not aggressive. A warning. Grant opened the passenger door. Come on. Atlas didn't move. Grant had seen that posture only twice before. Once outside a compound, where insurgents had buried pressure plates beneath loose gravel. Once beside a collapsed school, where unstable concrete threatened to fall. Atlas trusted his nose more than any map, more than any command. The wind swept across the empty yard. Somewhere above them, a single curtain moved behind the 3rd floor glass. Grant looked up sharply. The window became still again. When he turned back, Atlas was still standing beside the truck, refusing to take one more step toward the house. Grant had trusted that posture before. Once outside Kandahar, Atlas had frozen beside a dirt road, while every human eye saw nothing but dust and tire tracks. 30 seconds later, an engineer uncovered an improvised explosive device buried inches beneath the surface. The dog had never been wrong. Grant looked from Atlas to the towering Victorian. You smell something? Atlas didn't blink. His eyes stayed fixed on the 3rd floor window. Another low rumble rolled through his chest. Not fear, concern. Grant shut the truck door without forcing him. If you're staying, he said quietly. I'm not dragging you. He slipped the brass key into the weathered lock. It resisted, then turned with a dry metallic click. The front door eased inward, releasing a breath of stale air that carried old pine, cold stone, dust, and the faint sweetness of aged paper. Grant waited. Old, ranger, habit, never rushed through an unknown doorway. He stood just outside the threshold, letting his eyes adjust before entering. Corners, first, left, right, ceiling, floor. No movement. No fresh footprints. No obvious signs of squatters. He stepped inside. The enormous hallway swallowed the sound of his boots. Gray afternoon light seeped through cracks around boarded windows, leaving long bars of pale light across the warped oak floor. A chandelier hung overhead beneath thick webs, untouched for years. The staircase curved upward toward darkness. Grant instinctively counted exits. Front door, kitchen door, likely cellar access somewhere behind the stairs. If things went sideways, he'd have options. He always needed options. Outside, Atlas still hadn't moved. Grant glanced back. "You've covered me before." The dog remained planted beside the truck, watching, waiting. Grant took another slow step, then another. The house answered with a soft groan deep inside its timbers. Old wood, settling, nothing unusual. Still, something about the silence felt organized, not empty. Listening, he moved room by room. The parlor held overturned furniture draped in gray dust, a cracked marble fireplace, built-in bookshelves stripped almost bare. The dining room contained a massive oak table too heavy for thieves to bother moving. Everywhere he looked, he found neglect, never vandalism. It was as though the house had simply been abandoned in the middle of breathing. Grant crouched beside one window. The frame had swollen from years of moisture, reppable. The floor beneath remained solid. Good bones. He whispered the words almost without realizing it. The same words his father used whenever they rebuilt barns outside Casper. Bad skin. Strong frame. A loud slam exploded somewhere upstairs. Grant reacted before conscious thought arrived. His body dropped. Left foot back. Weight lowered. Eyes searching. His right hand swept toward a sidearm that had not hung on his belt in almost a decade. Nothing. Just empty air. The hallway dissolved for one violent heartbeat. Sand. Heat. Rotor blades. Contact. Someone shouting over gunfire. Dust bursting from a mud wall. The smell of burned diesel. Another blast. White light. Grant's breathing shortened. His heartbeat accelerated. Every muscle tightened. He could hear the high metallic ringing that always came before the memories fully took over. Outside, Atlas barked. Once, sharp, commanding. The sound sliced clean through Afghanistan. Grant blinked. The hallway returned. Dust floated lazily beneath the chandelier. No explosions. No soldiers. Only an old house. He exhaled slowly through his nose. Good correction. He whispered toward the doorway. Atlas stepped one paw inside. Only one. Just enough to touch Grant's boot with his nose. The familiar pressure lingered for 2 seconds, grounding him. Then the dog backed outside again. Grant rested one hand against Atlas's neck. "I'm back." The shepherd blinked once, satisfied. Grant spent the next hour inspecting the first floor. The plumbing had frozen years ago. The electrical panel looked original. One corner of the kitchen ceiling had collapsed. Nothing surprised him. He had seen villages rebuilt from less. As evening settled across the mountains, he gathered dead branches from the yard and lit a small fire in the stone fireplace. After carefully checking the chimney, smoke climbed cleanly. At least, that still worked. He shared the last can of beans with Atlas. The shepherd finally entered the house, slowly, reluctantly, never taking his eyes off the staircase. Darkness settled quickly in the Wyoming mountains. Grant spread his sleeping bag near the fireplace. Atlas refused. Instead, he positioned himself across the bottom step, facing upward, every muscle alert. Grant noticed. "You guarding me?" Atlas didn't move. Wind rattled loose shutters. Branches scraped against the roof. The old house sighed. Grant closed his eyes. Sleep never arrived gently anymore. It came in fragments, an hour, maybe less. Then, another dream. This one began with rotor blades again. A landing zone outside Jalalabad. Night operation, green tracer fire. Someone yelling his name. He spun toward the sound. A heavy footstep echoed directly above him. Not in the dream. Inside the house. Grant's eyes snapped open. The fire had burned low. Moonlight stretched across the floor. Another step, slow, measured. Above the second floor. Atlas was already moving without barking, without hesitation. He bounded up the staircase, 3 steps at a time. Grant grabbed his flashlight and followed. The beam cut through the darkness. Atlas disappeared around the landing, then stopped, completely silent. Grant reached the second floor, just in time to see the shepherd standing rigid at the far end of the hallway, blocking the staircase that climbed toward the 3rd floor. His ears stood high, his eyes locked on the darkness above. His lips barely parted. A warning growl rolled through the empty house, soft, steady, certain. Whatever Atlas sensed, it was waiting somewhere above them. Grant killed the flashlight for a moment. Darkness settled over the hallway, like a heavy blanket. He listened, not with his ears alone, with the same quiet awareness that had kept him alive through countless patrols. Wind, old wood, a loose shutter tapping somewhere outside. Nothing else. He switched the flashlight back on. The beam stretched toward the narrow staircase leading to the 3rd floor. "Easy," he whispered. Atlas didn't move. The German shepherd stood broadside across the first step, blocking Grant's path as deliberately as a soldier guarding a checkpoint. Grant crouched beside him. "What is it, partner?" Atlas's ears twitched, then his nose lifted toward the air. The dog wasn't looking for movement. He was scenting. Grant trusted that more than his own eyes. After nearly a minute, Atlas slowly backed away from the staircase. Not because whatever concerned him had disappeared, only because he had decided Grant could move again. They climbed together. Each stair complained beneath their weight. Grant tested every tread before committing his full balance. Years of mountain repairs had taught him that rotten wood often looked stronger than it was. The 3rd floor opened into a long corridor beneath the steep roofline. Doors lined both sides. Most stood half open. Moonlight leaked through cracks in boarded windows, laying silver bars across the floor. Grant swept the flashlight carefully. Left corner, right corner, ceiling, floor clear. Halfway down the hall, Atlas stopped again. This time, he wasn't staring ahead. He was looking down. The dog pawed once at the floorboards. Grant knelt. One plank had sunk slightly lower than the others. He pressed it gently with the handle of his flashlight. The board flexed. Rot. He marked the spot with a piece of blue painter's tape from his repair bag. One hazard remembered. One less surprise tomorrow. He continued toward the tower room. The door hung crooked on rusted hinges. Inside the circular room, overlooked the valley through tall windows. Most were boarded. One remained uncovered. The same window Atlas had watched from below. Grant walked toward it. Nothing. Only pine trees swaying beneath drifting clouds. The curtain moved again. He frowned. No breeze reached this room. He checked the frame. The lower sash refused to budge. Then he noticed it. A narrow gap beside the casing. Cold air slipped steadily through it, enough to stir the old lace curtain. He almost laughed. "So that's your ghost." Atlas didn't. The shepherd wasn't interested in the window anymore. He had crossed the room and stood beside the far wall waiting. Grant aimed the flashlight. Only faded wallpaper covered in tiny blue flowers. Nothing unusual. Atlas scratched once. Not frantically. Just once. Then he looked at Grant. Grant walked over. He tapped the wall with his knuckles, solid. He tapped again, 2 feet farther along. The sound changed. Not hollow. Different. He frowned, but said nothing. Tomorrow. There would be time tomorrow. Outside, dawn began washing pale light across the mountains. They spent the next several hours inspecting the roof. Grant climbed through an attic hatch carrying only a pry bar, tape measure, notebook, and hammer. No wasted movement, every step deliberate. Atlas followed. Despite the pain of squeezing through the narrow opening, dust coated everything. The rafters remained remarkably straight for a house abandoned over a decade. Grant measured spans, original timber, old-growth pine. Someone had built this place to last. Then, it happened. A sharp crack echoed beneath his boot. Training took over instantly. Weight backward. Shift left. Too late. The rotten joist split. The floor disappeared beneath him. Grant's body dropped toward the ceiling below. Before he could grab another beam, 70 pounds of German Shepherd slammed into his side. Atlas hit him, with every ounce of force he had. The impact threw Grant clear of the collapsing section. Both crashed across solid flooring. A massive timber followed a heartbeat later. It smashed through the rotten joist where Grant had been standing. The beam glanced off Atlas's shoulder with a sickening thud. The dog yelped. Grant rolled instantly. Atlas. The shepherd struggled to stand. His front left leg buckled. Grant's stomach tightened. He slipped one hand beneath Atlas's chest, the other supporting the injured shoulder. "Easy, buddy. Easy." Atlas tried to wag his tail anyway. Grant carried him down from the attic one careful step at a time. Back in the parlor, he opened the faded olive-drab medical pouch he had carried home from Afghanistan. Most of the supplies were newer. He replaced them every year. Some habits never left. He examined the shoulder. No obvious fracture. Deep bruising. A shallow cut from splintered wood. Grant flushed it with sterile saline. Atlas never pulled away, only watched him quietly. Grant applied antiseptic, wrapped the shoulder with a compression bandage, then rested his forehead gently against Atlas's. "You've saved my life twice now," Atlas answered, with a slow lick across Grant's weathered hand. Neither of them moved for a long moment. Outside, snowflakes drifted through the mountain air. Inside, the fire crackled softly. Grant finally poured fresh water into Atlas's bowl before opening the last package of beef jerky from his backpack. He tore it into tiny pieces. Atlas accepted each one gently, like the disciplined military dog he had always been. That afternoon, while Grant reinforced several weak floorboards downstairs, Atlas limped away without making a sound. Grant looked up moments later. The shepherd had climbed back to the 3rd floor again, ignoring the pain, ignoring the bandage. Grant followed quietly. Atlas wasn't standing by the tower window anymore. He had returned to the same stretch of faded blue wallpaper. The dog lowered himself carefully onto the floor despite the injured shoulder. Then he reached out one paw and scratched the wall again, this time harder. 3 slow strokes, as if trying to tell Grant. The answers weren't hidden somewhere in the house. They were hidden behind it. Grant looked from the faded wallpaper to Atlas's tired eyes. The shepherd lowered his head onto his front paws, breathing evenly despite the fresh bandage wrapped around his shoulder. "You've earned a break," Grant said quietly. Atlas answered with a slow blink. He didn't move away from the wall. Grant made a mental note of the exact location before heading downstairs. Some questions demanded daylight, proper tools, and a clear head. That lesson had been carved into him long before Afghanistan. Never breach an unknown space when you're tired. The next morning, snow dusted the mountain in a thin, white blanket. Grant loaded a handwritten list into his pocket. Roofing cement, heavy tarp, padlock, lantern fuel, nails, 2x, 4s, if he could afford them. Atlas limped beside him toward the pickup, favoring his left shoulder, but refusing to stay behind. The road into Elk Ridge wound through pine forests, where fog drifted low between the trees. The little mountain town looked almost unchanged from 50 years earlier. Brick storefronts lining a single main street beneath weathered signs. Grant parked beside a faded building with hand-painted letters, Dawson Salvage and Supply. The bell above the door jingled softly. Inside smelled of pine lumber, machine oil, old leather, and coffee that had been sitting on the burner since dawn. A broad-shouldered woman with silver hair looked up from behind the counter. She wore denim overalls beneath a heavy flannel shirt, and her hands carried the rough strength of someone who had spent a lifetime lifting more than paperwork. "You new around here?" she asked. Grant nodded. "Just bought a place." She smiled politely. "Which one?" "The hallway place." The smile disappeared. Even the old clock on the wall seemed louder. "You serious?" Grant simply slid the brass key onto the counter. The woman stared at it for several seconds, then back at him. "My name's Mabel Dawson." "Grant Mercer." Her eyes shifted to Atlas. "And who's this handsome fellow?" "Atlas." The old shepherd sat beside Grant without a sound. Mabel came around the counter slowly and let Atlas sniff the back of her hand before scratching behind one ear. "You've seen things, haven't you?" Atlas leaned into the touch. "He always knows good people," Grant said. Mabel looked toward the front window, as if checking whether anyone stood outside listening. "You'll hear stories. I'm sure I will. They'll tell you Agnes Holloway kidnapped children." Grant didn't answer. "They'll tell you lights burned in that tower every night." She paused. "They'll tell you voices carried through the woods." Grant rested both hands on the counter. "What do you believe?" Mabel was quiet long enough for the coffee pot to hiss softly. "I believe folks make ghosts out of things they're too afraid to understand." Grant studied her face. "You knew her." "I saw her." "Not the same thing." "No." Mabel looked somewhere far beyond the walls of her shop when I was a little girl. My mother used to leave baskets of vegetables at the bottom of that hill. For Agnes. We never knocked. Why? Because Daddy said if Agnes wanted company, she'd invite it. She gave a dry laugh. She never did. Grant gathered the supplies he could afford. The total came to $38. He had 27. Before he could speak, Mabel quietly crossed out several numbers on the receipt. "Senior discount," she said. Grant raised an eyebrow. "I'm 45. I wasn't talking about you." She winked toward Atlas. Grant laughed for the first time in months. It surprised both of them. As she packed the supplies into a weathered cardboard box, Mabel slipped in a kerosene lantern. "You forgot this." "I didn't order one." "I know." He reached for his wallet. She closed his hand around it. "Pay me after your roof stops leaking." Grant looked at her for a long moment. "I don't like owing people." "You served." So did Atlas. She nodded toward the dog. I think the two of you have already paid more than enough. Outside, a black luxury SUV rolled quietly into the gravel parking lot. It looked strangely out of place among rusty pickups and logging trucks. A man in a tailored charcoal coat stepped out. Early 60s, silver hair, polished boots, untouched by mud. He smiled before speaking. Mr. Mercer. Grant turned. I am. The stranger extended a hand. Victor Sloan. Grant shook it. The grip was practiced. Confident. Measured. I heard someone finally bought the Holloway property. News travels fast. It usually does, in a town this size. Victor glanced toward the mountain ridge where the house stood, hidden beyond the pines. I'll save us both some time. He reached inside his coat and removed a business card. I'd like to buy it. Grant waited. $12,000. Silence settled between them. Mabel stopped, unpacking inventory. Even Atlas had risen to his feet. You paid 15. Victor continued smoothly. I'm offering 12,000 today. Grant looked past him toward the snowy mountains. Then back again. No. Victor smiled, as though he had expected the answer. You should think about it. I already did. That house isn't worth rebuilding. Grant shrugged. It doesn't have to be. Victor's smile became thinner. My company has plans for that ridge. I'm sure it does. I don't enjoy seeing veterans make expensive mistakes. Grant held his gaze. I've made bigger ones. Neither man spoke for several seconds. Finally, Victor tucked the business card beneath one of the ropes, securing Grant's supply box. If you change your mind, I won't. Victor nodded once. Have a good afternoon, Mr. Mercer. He drove away without another word. Mabel watched until the SUV disappeared. Then she whispered almost to herself, he doesn't usually hear no. Grant loaded the supplies into the truck. By the time he reached the mountain again, the sun had already dipped behind the western ridge. Atlas climbed out first. His ears flattened. A low growl escaped his throat. Grant followed his gaze. Something white fluttered against the broken front gate, a fresh county notice stapled to the weathered post. He pulled it free. Unsafe structure. Notice of condemnation review. Hearing scheduled in 10 days. Recommendation. Demolition. Grant folded the paper once, then slipped it carefully into the inside pocket of his old ranger jacket beside the deed. Atlas stood silently at the gate, looking past the notice, past the porch, back toward the third-floor window, as though whatever waited inside had already known. They were running out of time. Grant slept lightly, not because of the condemnation notice folded inside his jacket, because Atlas never left the third floor. Twice, during the night, Grant climbed the stairs, carrying the kerosene lantern. Both times, he found the German shepherd, lying beside the same faded stretch of blue wallpaper. His injured shoulder rested awkwardly against the floor. His eyes stayed open, watching, waiting. Grant knelt beside him. You could have picked any room, Atlas answered by touching the wall once with his nose. Then he looked back at Grant. The same look he had worn before hidden explosives. Not fear, certainty. Morning brought sharp mountain sunlight and air cold enough to sting Grant's lungs. Coffee heated slowly over the fireplace while he unfolded the county notice again. 10 days. He folded it away. Deadlines had never scared him. Unknowns did. He climbed upstairs carrying a tape measure, carpenter's pencil, framing square, flashlight, and notebook. Old habits. When a building didn't make sense, measure it. He started outside. The eastern wall stretched 74 feet from corner to corner. He wrote the number. Inside the third-floor hallway, measured barely 58. Grant checked again. Same answer. He frowned. 16 feet. Missing. He walked the hallway once more, counting strides, checking each doorway. The tower room should have connected naturally with the rest of the floor. Instead, the corridor simply ended. Too soon. He stood motionless. Atlas limped beside him and quietly sat in front of the wallpaper. Grant looked from the dog to the hallway, back toward the tower. The geometry didn't lie. Somewhere, beyond that wall, there was space. He tapped gently with the handle of his hammer. Solid, solid, solid. Then thunk. Not hollow exactly, but different. The sound carried less weight. Grant marked the spot with his pencil. He moved 2 feet left, saw it again. Back to the mark. Thunk. Atlas's ears lifted. Grant smiled faintly. You've been trying to tell me. The shepherd's tail thumped once against the dusty floor. Grant crouched lower. His fingertips traced the faded wallpaper instead of attacking it immediately. Military reconnaissance had taught him patience. People focused on obvious clues. Real answers usually hid inside small inconsistencies. The wallpaper stopped beneath the baseboard. Every other room in the house showed paper tucked neatly behind the trim. This section had been cut afterward. Someone had covered something. Carefully, deliberately. Grant slipped his utility knife beneath one loose seam. The old paper peeled away surprisingly easily. Dry glue crackled softly. A strip, nearly 3 feet long, drifted to the floor. Behind it, no plaster, wood. Wide vertical pine boards, much newer than the surrounding walls. Grant peeled another section, then another. Atlas rose despite his sore shoulder. Standing directly beside him, the hidden shape slowly appeared. Door casing, old oak painted over decades earlier. Grant stepped back. Someone hadn't built another wall. Someone had hidden a doorway. He ran his palm over the boards. Tiny square nails. Hand-driven. Much older than modern framing. Whoever sealed the room hadn't wanted to destroy it, only erase it. Grant examined the floor. No fresh tool marks. No recent disturbance. Dust rested evenly. Across everything. This door hadn't been touched in years, maybe decades. Atlas suddenly weighed. A quiet sound. Almost impatient. Grant looked outside. Snow clouds gathered over the western ridge. The afternoon light had already begun fading behind the mountains. He remembered something Sergeant Cole used to repeat before every raid. Never clear unknown rooms after dark. Darkness gives uncertainty another weapon. Grant rested the pry bar against the wall. Tomorrow, Atlas stared at him. I know. The shepherd didn't move. Grant sighed. You disagree. Atlas lay back down in front of the hidden doorway, refusing to leave, almost standing guard. That evening, Grant repaired the front porch post until moonlight replaced daylight. Fresh timber, lag bolts, temporary support. One problem solved. 20 more waiting. Inside, he heated canned stew over the fire. Atlas barely touched his food. Instead, the dog climbed upstairs again. Grant followed, carrying the lantern. Atlas had resumed his silent watch before the concealed door. Grant leaned against the opposite wall. You think somebody's still in there? The old house answered with a slow, settling groan. Nothing more. He found himself studying the hallway again. Clear's throat. Everything fit now. The missing 16 feet. The newer boards. The altered wallpaper. Someone had gone to extraordinary effort to make people forget this room existed. Why? Hide valuables? Hide evidence? Hide memories? His thoughts drifted briefly toward Victor Sloan, toward $12,000, toward a demolition order arriving less than 24 hours after refusing to sell. Coincidences rarely stayed coincidences for long. Not in combat, not in life. Grant rolled his sleeping bag into the hallway, instead of returning downstairs. Atlas remained beside the hidden door, close enough that Grant could rest one hand on the dog's back. The shepherd relaxed for the first time all day. Near midnight, Grant woke suddenly. Not from a nightmare, from silence. The mountain wind had stopped completely. The house no longer creaked. No branches scratched the roof. No shutters rattled, only stillness. Atlas was already standing, his ears pointed toward the concealed doorway. Then, very softly, Grant heard it. Not a voice, not footsteps, a faint current of moving air, barely audible, flowing from somewhere behind the hidden wall. He slowly reached for the pry bar resting beside his sleeping bag. Tomorrow had suddenly become right now. Grant wrapped one hand around the pry bar. The other held the lantern low, keeping the light below eye level, the way he had learned to move through dark buildings overseas. Bright light blinded the man, carrying it long before it exposed anyone hiding inside. Atlas remained beside the wall, alert, silent. Grant slid the flat end of the pry bar beneath the first pine board. The old nails protested with a long, aching squeal. The sound echoed through the empty house. He paused, listened. Nothing answered. Another board came loose, then another. Dust drifted into the lantern light, like slow-falling snow. Behind the pine boards stood exactly what he had expected. An old oak door. Its brass knob had darkened with age, but there was almost no rust on the hinges. Someone had oiled them before sealing the room away. Not abandoned, preserved. Grant brushed decades of dust from the frame. Atlas stepped closer until his shoulder touched Grant's leg. "You ready?" The shepherd looked at the door. Grant turned the knob. It moved easily. The door swung inward without a sound. Cold air rolled gently across the hallway. Not the stale air of an abandoned room. Something cleaner, drier, as though time itself had slowed behind that doorway. Grant raised the lantern. The circle of light reached only a few feet inside before disappearing into darkness. Clear left. He swept the beam clear right. No movement, no footprints, no signs of recent intrusion. He entered slowly. Atlas stayed, glued to his side. The lantern climbed higher. Grant stopped breathing. There was no treasure, no stacks of cash, no hidden vault. The room looked lived in, or rather left exactly as someone intended. A small iron bed stood neatly against one wall. A handmade quilt rested across it, gray beneath years of dust, but still folded with careful corners. A wooden rocking chair faced a tall window. The window itself had been painted black from the inside, every inch of glass deliberately covered. Someone had wanted no light escaping this room. Bookshelves lined two walls from floor to ceiling, not filled with books, filled with wooden boxes, dozens, then hundreds. Everyone carefully labeled. First names, dates, years. Emma, 1974. Jacob, 1982. Sarah, 1991. Michael, 1968. Some labels had faded until only fragments remained. Others looked almost new. Atlas walked past everything else. He ignored the bed, ignored the rocking chair, ignored the shelves. Instead, he stopped before an old oak writing desk beneath the painted window. His nose rested gently against the edge. Grant followed. A thick, leather-bound journal lay in the center, unlike everything else. The cover carried almost no dust. Someone had wiped it clean, again and again, for years. Grant carefully opened the first page. Elegant handwriting filled the paper. Not hurried, not decorative, simply careful. At the top was a single sentence. Every child deserved one safe night. Grant stared. He turned the page. Another entry. November 12th. Boy, about 10 years old, found sleeping beneath the church bridge. Stayed 3 weeks. Left with new boots and enough food for the trip to his uncle's ranch. Another page. Young mother. No questions asked. Baby slept through the night for the first time. Another girl wouldn't speak. Stayed 6 months. Started smiling before she left. Grant slowly lowered himself into the chair. His hands had become strangely careful, as though the pages might bruise. Atlas lay beside his boots. The shepherd rested his chin across Grant's foot. Grant kept reading. Grant kept reading. Each page recorded another child, another frightened teenager, another family, with nowhere left to go. No praise, no complaints, only names, dates, needs, and quiet hope. His eyes drifted toward the shelves. The wooden boxes suddenly looked different. Not storage. Keepsakes. Lives. Pieces. People had left behind. A baseball glove. A school ribbon. A faded photograph. A stuffed rabbit. Every box belonged to someone. Someone. Agnes Holloway had refused to forget. Grant reached toward the nearest one. He hesitated, then opened it. Inside rested a tiny pair of red mittens. A Christmas card drawn in crayon. 2 missing baby teeth, wrapped carefully in tissue. And a note. Started first grade smiling, finally sleeps through thunderstorms. Grant swallowed hard. His chest tightened for reasons entirely different from Afghanistan. He remembered another winter. Not overseas. Wyoming. He had been 9. His father had spent 3 months looking for work after the sawmill closed. Money disappeared. The furnace stopped running. One December evening, a stranger had left groceries on their porch without signing a card. His mother cried while pretending she wasn't. Grant had never learned who brought them. He suddenly wondered how many strangers had quietly saved lives without anyone ever knowing. Atlas lifted his head. The shepherd looked toward the painted window. Grant followed his gaze. He scratched gently at one corner with his thumbnail. Black paint flaked away. Behind it, morning sunlight spilled through old glass. Warm, golden, alive. For the first time in years, light entered the hidden room. Grant looked back. Across the shelves, hundreds of names, hundreds of stories, hundreds of children. The town had whispered for decades that Agnes Holloway stole children. The truth felt infinitely heavier. She had been sheltering them, quietly, secretly, for years. He closed the journal, carefully, not because he was finished reading, because he suddenly understood. He wasn't holding the history of one old house. He was holding the reason someone had wanted the room forgotten. Atlas leaned against his leg. Outside, wind swept softly through the pines. Inside the hidden room, the first rays of morning touched the rows of wooden boxes. And for the first time in many years, none of them sat in darkness anymore. Grant left the hidden room only after the morning sun had climbed over the eastern ridge. Before closing the concealed door, he looked back one last time. The shelves, the boxes, the journal resting on the oak desk. Nothing had changed, yet everything had. He carefully pulled the hidden door shut, but left the pine boards stacked neatly against the hallway wall. No more hiding. Not anymore. Atlas waited beside him. The shepherd's bandaged shoulder looked stiff, but his eyes were brighter than they had been since arriving. Grant rubbed the dog's neck. You found it. Atlas leaned against him, not proudly, simply as though the mission had reached its first objective. The next 3 days became routine. Grant worked from sunrise until darkness. Roof first, then porch supports, broken windows, leaking gutters. He attacked every problem, the same way he had once planned patrol routes. Never chase 10 objectives. Complete one, move, complete the next. Every repair earned a photograph with the disposable camera. Mabel had quietly slipped into his supply box. Evidence mattered, especially when someone wanted your work erased. The condemnation hearing was now only 7 days away. Victor Sloan returned on the 4th morning. This time, he wasn't alone. A white county pickup stopped beside his black SUV. A building inspector climbed out carrying a clipboard. Grant watched from the porch without saying a word. Atlas stood beside him, hackles raised. Victor smiled pleasantly. "Morning, Mr. Mercer." Grant nodded once. The inspector introduced himself before beginning a slow walk around the property. He photographed cracked masonry, measured the porch, checked the chimney, never once stepped inside. Grant noticed. Observation. Always observation. The inspector wasn't looking for reasons to save the house, only reasons to condemn it. Victor wandered toward the porch. "I see you've been keeping busy." Grant sanded a porch rail without looking up, trying. Victor folded his hands. "I'd hate to see all this effort wasted." Grant brushed sawdust from the timber. "Funny." "What is?" "You sound like you've already read the decision." Victor's smile held. "I've simply attended enough hearings." Grant met his eyes. "So have I." Victor tilted his head. "Victor, I wasn't aware the Army handled zoning disputes." "They don't." Grant stood. "They teach you how to recognize when someone's shaping the battlefield before the fight begins." For the first time, Victor's smile paused only for a second. Then, it returned. "I hope you're wrong." He walked back toward his SUV. Grant watched him leave. Atlas never stopped watching until both vehicles disappeared below the ridge. That night, snow began falling again. Heavy, wet. Grant reinforced another section of roof before climbing down in darkness. Atlas suddenly froze near the back fence, his ears locked forward. One sharp bark, then he ran. Grant grabbed his flashlight. "Atlas." The shepherd disappeared into the trees. Grant followed. Years of ranger training returned without effort. Flashlight off. Let his eyes adjust. Move with the terrain. Stay below the ridgeline. The snow carried fresh footprints. Not deer, boots. Someone had crossed behind the property less than an hour earlier. Grant crouched. The prints stopped beside the woods. Atlas growled somewhere ahead. Then came a sharp metallic clang. A yelp. Grant's heartbeat surged. Atlas. He sprinted through the pines. The flashlight beam caught the shepherd struggling near a fallen log. A length of rusted rebar protruded from the snow. Atlas had crashed into it while chasing whoever had fled. Blood stained the white ground beneath his flank. Grant dropped to one knee. His breathing stayed calm. Hands steady, pressure first. Find the wound. The metal hadn't pierced deeply, but it had sliced through muscle along Atlas's side. Grant wrapped the injury tightly, using his field dressing. The shepherd whimpered once, then tried to stand. No. Grant slid both arms beneath him. "I've got you." Atlas weighed nearly 80 pounds. Grant carried every one of them over fallen timber across icy ground, down the mountain trail, 2 miles without stopping. The veterinary clinic sat on the edge of town, with only one light burning. Doctor. Deucer. Trasser. Trammed. Captor. Trammed her, Emily Foster opened the door before Grant reached the steps. She took one look at Atlas. Bring him in. No paperwork, no questions, only action. Grant stood beside the operating table while Emily cleaned the wound. 12 stitches. She glanced at him. He was lucky. Grant stroked Atlas's head while the dog rested under mild sedation. He usually makes his own luck. Emily smiled gently. He made yours too, judging by these old scars. Grant looked down. Atlas's gray muzzle rested peacefully against the blanket. I owe him more than I can repay. No. Emily tied the final stitch. You just keep showing up. Near dawn, Atlas finally fell asleep. Grant sat beside him in the quiet examination room. Emily had left coffee on the counter without interrupting the silence. Grant reached into his jacket for the condemnation notice. Instead, his fingers touched something else. A folded page. It had slipped from the journal while he was reading in the hidden room. He carefully unfolded it. Different handwriting. Same careful ink. The heading read simply Final Records. Grant frowned. This wasn't another diary entry. It looked like a list. Names. Years. Notes. He read the first few, then stopped. His eyes narrowed. Somewhere farther down the page, one name had been underlined decades ago. Grant couldn't yet make out the faded ink beneath the crease. He unfolded the page completely. Atlas stirred weakly on the table. Outside, first light touched the snowy mountains. Grant leaned closer. Whatever Agnes Holloway had written on that final list had survived all these years waiting for someone to read it. Grant carried the folded page to the window, where the early light was strongest. The paper had yellowed with age, but the ink remained surprisingly clear. Each line followed the same quiet pattern. A first name, a date, a destination, sometimes only a single sentence. Sent to an aunt in Idaho. Found work at the sawmill. Joined the Navy. Graduated nursing school. Married. 3 children. Agnes had never written about herself. Only about what became of the people who had walked through her door. Grant slowly followed the entries down the page. Near the bottom, one line stopped him cold. Victoria Ann Sloan arrived April 1961. 17 years old. 7 months expecting. Stayed until the boy was born. Left with her family before summer. The next line had been added years later in shakier handwriting. Her son grew into a builder. He never knew where his first home was. If this page survives me, give the truth back to him. Grant read it again, then a third time. The room around him seemed to grow quieter. Victor Sloan, not Victoria. Her son, the wealthy developer who had spent years trying to tear down Holloway House, had entered the world inside it. Grant folded the page carefully. His fingers had become unusually gentle. He had carried classified intelligence overseas. Maps. Coordinates. Names that could redirect entire operations. This single sheet felt heavier than any of them. Atlas stirred. The shepherd opened his eyes slowly, still groggy from medication. Grant rested a hand on his neck. You picked the right house. Atlas's tail thumped weakly against the blanket. Dr. Emily Foster stepped back into the room carrying fresh bandages. How's our patient? He'll complain if you ask him. Emily smiled while checking the stitches. He'll need a few days. Grant nodded. I'll make it work. She looked at him for a moment. Can I ask something? He waited. Most people would have sold that place the first day. Grant glanced toward Atlas. I've seen enough buildings come down. Emily followed his eyes. This one feels different. It isn't the house, but what is it? Grant thought about the shelves, the boxes, the journal, then quietly answered. Somebody spent 60 years proving strangers mattered. Emily didn't ask another question. By afternoon, Atlas insisted on walking slowly, carefully. The climb back to the mountain took nearly twice as long. Every few hundred yards, Grant stopped, so the shepherd could rest. Neither complained. They had crossed harder ground together. When the old Victorian finally appeared between the pines, Atlas lifted his head. The familiar house stood silent against the gray sky. Grant unlocked the front door. Nothing had been disturbed, yet something felt wrong. Not dangerous. Observed. He instinctively scanned the rooms, corners, windows, ceiling lines. A ranger's mind never truly retired. Outside the back porch, he noticed fresh tire tracks in the melting snow. Too new. Not his truck. Too wide for Mabel's pickup. Grant crouched. Deep tread. Expensive all-terrain tires. Victor's SUV. He hadn't come to buy. He'd come to look. That evening, Grant climbed to the hidden room alone. Atlas settled beside the doorway, despite the soreness in his side. The shepherd refused to leave the entrance unguarded. Grant opened Agnes's journal again. He searched for April 1961. Several pages later, he found it. A frightened young woman, sent by a pastor, who trusted silence more than institutions. Healthy baby boy, strong lungs. Mother cried when she left. Promised she would come back. She never could. At the bottom of the page, Agnes had added another sentence, years later. He builds homes now. I hope one day he learns he first found shelter here. Grant closed the journal. He leaned back in the old chair. The lantern flame flickered softly. He imagined Victor Sloan as an infant, wrapped in a blanket inside this very room. No boardrooms, no tailored suits, no development company, just another child whose mother had nowhere else to go. Outside the hidden room, Atlas gave a low warning growl. Grant stood immediately. The sound wasn't aimed at the house. It came from outside. He crossed to the tower window, where he had scraped away part of the black paint. The valley below stretched beneath the evening sky. Far down the winding road, a black SUV sat motionless beside the treeing. Its lights were off. Its engine wasn't. Someone was watching the house. Grant observed for nearly a minute. The vehicle never moved. Military instinct whispered the same thing it always had. Observation before action. Someone gathering information, not yet making contact. He quietly stepped away from the window. Atlas watched him. Grant looked down at the folded page in his hand. One sentence repeated itself inside his mind. Give the truth back to him. Not expose him. Not destroy him. Not use him. Give it back. Grant slid the page into the inside pocket of his ranger jacket beside the property deed. He finally understood why Agnes had written those exact words. This page could end Victor Sloan's reputation overnight. Or it could return a missing piece of a man's life. Atlas rested his head against Grant's knee. Grant scratched gently behind one ear. I know. The shepherd closed his eyes. Outside, the SUV's engine finally started. Its headlights swept briefly across the snow before disappearing down the mountain road. Grant remained at the window long after it was gone. The coming hearing was no longer just about saving a house. It had quietly become a decision about what kind of man he still wanted to be. Grant slept with the folded page inside his jacket. He woke before dawn with his heart hammering against his ribs. Not because of the cold, because someone was screaming. He sat upright before he realized the scream existed only inside his head. A helicopter banked low across a brown Afghan valley. Dust exploded beneath its rotors. Someone shouted, "Medic!" Another voice called his name. Then came the sharp crack of rifle fire. Grant's hand shot toward the pistol that hadn't been there in 9 years. His breathing shortened. The room dissolved into sand, smoke, and broken stone. A warm nose pressed against his wrist. Atlas, the German shepherd, stood beside the sleeping bag, despite the fresh stitches in his side. Grant closed his eyes. He counted slowly. 4 breaths in. 4 breaths out. The mountain returned. The fire had burned to glowing embers. Snow tapped softly against the tower window. "I'm here," Grant whispered. Atlas settled beside him, without another sound. The nightmare ended the same way it always did, not because it disappeared, because Atlas refused to let Grant stay inside it. Morning found Grant repairing window frames, instead of thinking. Morning, likes. The nightmare ended. The same way. His hands preferred work over memory. Plane, measure, fit, repeat. Every smooth shaving curling from the old pine reminded him of rebuilding forward operating bases after rocket attacks. One board at a time. One problem at a time. End of 60A. Atlas rested nearby beneath the porch, watching the road. Every few minutes, his ears lifted. Still guarding. Still working. Even injured. Grant admired that dogs never questioned purpose. People did. By midday, he climbed back into the hidden room, carrying Agnes Holloway's journal. The lantern glowed softly beneath the painted tower window. Dust floated lazily through its light. Grant searched until he found the final pages. The handwriting had become shakier, slower. Age had reached Agnes's hands, but not her heart. One final folded letter rested inside the back cover. Unlike the records, it carried no names, only a sentence. For whoever finds this room. Grant unfolded it carefully. The paper trembled slightly between his fingers. If you have opened this door, then the house has trusted you. Please don't make the mistake others have made. People will try to use these names to shame, to threaten, to clear's throat bargain. Don't. Every child who entered this house arrived carrying enough fear already. Return the truth to the people it belongs to. Never use it as a weapon. Keep the door open. Nothing else matters. Grant read the words twice, then a third time. His eyes drifted toward the folded page inside his jacket. Victor Sloan. One sentence spoken publicly at the hearing would destroy him. Every newspaper would print it. Every television station would repeat it. His company would collapse beneath the scandal before anyone bothered asking whether there had ever been anything shameful about the truth. Grant knew exactly how information became ammunition. He had watched governments do it. Insurgents do it. Politicians do it. Sometimes soldiers did it too. The weapon was rarely the truth itself. It was the decision about when to reveal it. Atlas limped quietly across the room. Instead of lying beside Grant, he stopped before Agnes's desk. His nose rested gently against the letter. Grant smiled faintly. "You've picked your side." Atlas blinked once. That evening, Mabel Dawson arrived, carrying 2 containers of beef stew. She looked first at Atlas, then at the fresh bandage. "Heard somebody brought my favorite customer to Doc Foster." Grant accepted the food. "He'll be all right," I figured. She looked toward the hidden room, without yet knowing it existed. "You finding anything worth saving?" Grant thought for several seconds, then answered honestly, "More than I expected." She nodded, as though she understood more than he had actually said. Before leaving, she paused beside the porch steps. Grant looked up. "Folks around town are talking about what?" "They've started asking why Victor Sloan wants that hill so badly." Grant watched snowflakes drift between the pine branches. "I imagine he'll have an answer. I'm sure he will." She hesitated. "You don't owe anybody a fight, Grant." He smiled wearily. "Sometimes the fight shows up anyway." Night settled over the mountain once again. Grant carried the folded page downstairs. He sat beside the fire while Atlas slept with his head across Grant's boot. The house creaked softly around them. No longer haunted, simply old. Grant removed the page one final time. His thumb rested over Victor Sloane's name. He could almost hear Sergeant Cole again. Just because you can pull the trigger doesn't mean it's the right shot. Grant folded the paper along its original crease. Perfectly, carefully. He slid it into a plain envelope. Across the front, he wrote only 2 words. Victor Sloane. Nothing more. And no accusation, no explanation, no threat. Tomorrow, he would hand it back to the man who had unknowingly spent his entire life searching for the place where his story had truly begun. Whether Victor accepted it or tore it apart would no longer belong to Grant. The choice had already been made. Outside, Atlas suddenly raised his head. Not growling, not barking, simply listening. Headlights climbed the mountain road, a single vehicle moving slowly toward the house. Grant stood, envelope still in his hand. The hearing was tomorrow morning, but someone had decided not to wait. The headlights stopped just beyond the broken gate. Grant set the envelope on the mantel and reached for the flashlight. Not because he expected violence, because old habits refused to die. Atlas was already on his feet, despite the stitches along his side. His ears pointed toward the driveway. His body remained relaxed. No growl. No warning bark. Grant noticed. If Atlas wasn't alarmed, neither was he. A single figure stepped from the darkness. Victor Sloane. No attorney, no county officials, no polished speech prepared for an audience. Just one man standing beneath the porch light with snow gathering on his shoulders. Grant opened the door. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Victor finally broke the silence. I couldn't sleep. Grant nodded once. I figured. Victor looked past him into the old house. It feels different. It is. Condored, endes. Footnote. Victor looked past him. Grant reached for the envelope and held it out. I was going to give you this tomorrow. Victor accepted it carefully. His eyes moved from Grant to the handwriting across the front. Only his own name. Nothing else. You should read it alone. Victor looked uncertain for the first time since they had met. Why? Because it belongs to you. Grant stepped back. I'll see you in the morning. Victor hesitated, then quietly returned to his truck without opening the envelope. Its taillights disappeared into the falling snow. Grant closed the door. Atlas rested his head against Grant's leg. The shepherd's tail brushed the floor once. Mission complete. For now. The county annex was already crowded when Grant arrived the next morning. Atlas walked beside him, wearing his old service vest. His stitches pulled slightly with every step, but he refused to stay behind. People noticed the dog first, then the veteran. Whispers followed them through the room. The haunted house. That's him. So he actually came. Grant ignored every word. Combat had taught him something useful. Noise wasn't the same thing as danger. He sat quietly in the front row. Atlas lay beside his chair. The leather journal rested on Grant's lap. Behind him, the room continued filling. Mabel Dawson arrived, carrying a thermos of coffee. She touched Grant's shoulder as she passed. You don't stand alone today. Before Grant could answer, another elderly man entered. Then a woman with silver hair. Then a retired firefighter. Then 2 middle-aged teachers. Grant didn't recognize most of them, yet every one of them looked toward the journal with an expression that mixed curiosity and memory. Mabel leaned closer. I made a few phone calls. Grant glanced around. Looks like more than a few. They've been waiting longer than you know. The chairman called the meeting to order. The county inspector stood first. He listed every violation in a calm, practiced voice. Compromised roof, unsafe porch, outdated electrical system, code deficiencies. Grant listened without interruption. Most of it had once been true. Some of it no longer was. Photographs of Grant's repairs circulated among the commissioners. Temporary roof stabilization, structural reinforcement, secured entrances, progress. Real work. Then Victor Sloan stood. The room grew still. Grant studied him carefully. Victor looked different. The expensive suit remained. The confidence did not. He approached the podium slowly. My company has spent 3 years assembling property for a redevelopment project. His voice remained steady. I believe this parcel was simply the last obstacle. He paused. I was wrong. Several commissioners exchanged glances. Victor continued. I am withdrawing all interest in acquiring the hallway property. A murmur swept across the room. My company will not pursue demolition. His attorney looked stunned. Victor didn't acknowledge him. Grant lowered his eyes. He already knew why. The chairman turned toward Grant. Mr. Mercer, do you wish to speak? Grant stood. His knees reminded him of every parachute landing he had ever made. The journal felt heavier than it should have. He opened to the first page. His voice remained quiet, not dramatic, simply honest. Every child deserved one safe night. Silence settled over the room. Grant read several entries. A frightened teenager. Twin brothers, a young mother, a runaway. Nothing embellished. Nothing exaggerated. Just names, dates, simple acts of kindness. He closed the journal. For decades, he said, people believed Agnes Holloway hid terrible secrets inside that house. He looked around the room. They were right. Another pause. The secret was that she never stopped opening her door. No one moved. Grant continued. She kept children alive long enough for the rest of their lives to begin. From the third row, an elderly woman slowly stood. I stayed there. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. Winter of 1973. She sat down. A retired firefighter stood next. Summer of 1980. A teacher rose. 2 months, then another. And because of those 2 months, I finished high school. One by one they stood, never giving speeches, only a year. Sometimes one sentence. Enough. The room transformed quietly. The haunted house became something else. Not through argument, through memory. Grant looked toward Victor. The developer remained seated, head lowered, hands folded tightly together. Finally, he stood. My mother never told me where I was born. The room fell completely silent. Victor's voice caught for the first time. Last night, someone gave that story back to me. He looked directly at Grant. I spent years trying to erase the place that first saved my family. He swallowed. I didn't know. No one spoke. Victor turned toward the commission. I will personally pay every dollar of the outstanding taxes on that property. He looked around the room, not to own it, to honor it. The chairman removed his glasses. The inspector slowly closed his folder. After a long silence, the chairman spoke. The commission recommends conditional restoration rather than demolition. The vote that followed was unanimous. Grant closed his eyes briefly. Beside him, Atlas leaned gently against his leg. For the first time since Afghanistan, Grant realized he was no longer bracing for the next explosion. He was simply standing in a quiet room, watching strangers choose mercy. Grant had spent years believing battles ended with someone losing. That was how Afghanistan had taught him. Someone advanced. Someone retreated. Someone came home. someone didn't. But as people slowly filed out of the county annex, there was no cheering, no victory. Only quiet conversations. Old men shook hands with strangers. Women embraced people they had not seen in decades. The haunted house on the hill had somehow become everyone's story. Atlas leaned against Grant's leg. His tail brushed the worn carpet once. Grant reached down and scratched behind his ears. "You picked the right house." Atlas blinked, as though he'd known that from the beginning. The following morning, Victor Sloan walked into the county clerk's office carrying a certified check. $4,286. Every dollar of unpaid taxes. The young clerk who had handed Grant the rusted key only weeks before stared at the amount before looking back up. "You want your company's name on the receipt?" Victor shook his head. "No. The property's still Mr. Mercer's." The clerk hesitated. "You understand none of this gives you ownership." "I know." Victor signed the receipt. "For the first time in my life," he said quietly, "I'm paying a debt that belonged to my family long before I was born." Snow lingered across the Wyoming hills for another week. Then volunteers started arriving. Nobody organized them. Nobody advertised. One pickup appeared Monday morning, carrying reclaimed lumber. Another arrived Tuesday with windows salvaged from an old church. Wednesday brought a retired electrician named Earl Donovan. "I heard somebody finally decided this place deserved another chance." Grant offered to pay him. Earl laughed. "You can buy lunch. That's about all." Grant smiled for what felt like the first time in months. Deal. The work settled into a rhythm, just like patrols once had. Every morning Grant made a list. Roof, plumbing, windows, heat, one objective at a time. No shortcuts, no wasted movement. Atlas supervised every inch of it. Despite the stitches in his side, he limped from room to room, inspecting each repair. If a stranger climbed onto the property carrying lumber, Atlas sniffed their boots before quietly stepping aside. If someone walked too close to the hidden room upstairs, he followed without making a sound. The shepherd still understood what needed protecting. Some nights Grant woke anyway. A loose shutter slammed against the siding. His eyes opened instantly, heart racing. For one terrible second, the old house became a compound outside Kandahar. The wind became rotor blades. The furnace, settling beneath the floor, became distant mortar fire. His hand reached automatically toward a rifle that no longer existed. Atlas was already there. A warm nose pressed gently against Grant's wrist. The dog never barked, never startled him, only waited. Grant's breathing slowed. The room slowly became a bedroom again, not a battlefield. He rested his forehead against Atlas's. "Stand down." The shepherd sighed and settled back onto the rug. By morning, Grant realized something unusual. He had fallen asleep again, without another nightmare. It was the first uninterrupted night he'd had in years. Mabel Dawson transformed the old kitchen before anyone noticed. One afternoon, Grant came downstairs, smelling fresh bread. The enormous cast-iron stove glowed with steady heat. Soup simmered quietly. Coffee filled the room with warmth, stronger than the fire itself. "You planning to feed the whole county?" Grant asked. Mabel never looked up from kneading dough. "Looks that way." People began staying after work. Not because anyone asked, because nobody wanted to leave. Stories surfaced naturally. A retired deputy admitted Agnes had once hidden a runaway boy inside the cellar, while an abusive father searched the property. A school principal confessed she'd quietly sent frightened teenagers toward the hill for years, pretending she knew nothing afterward. Each story made the house feel less abandoned, more remembered. Victor came only on Saturdays. He arrived in faded jeans instead of tailored coats. He carried lumber himself, measured walls, replaced broken beams. Nobody treated him like a hero. He never expected them to. One afternoon, Grant found Victor standing alone in the hidden room. His mother's small keepsake box rested open on the desk. "I keep wondering," Victor said softly, "how different my life would have been if she'd told me." Grant adjusted an old window frame before answering. "Maybe she wanted you to grow up without carrying the weight." Victor nodded slowly, "And I spent 50 years inventing heavier ones." Neither man spoke again. Some conversations didn't require finishing. Spring finally reached the mountain. Clear's throat. Snow melted into clear streams. Wild flowers appeared beside the broken stone fence. Grant repaired the front porch one weathered board at a time. He refused to replace more than necessary. Old wood deserved respect. Just like old people. Just like old memories. Atlas climbed the finished steps carefully, still favoring one leg, still making his rounds. Grant watched him disappear toward the third floor. Moments later, the dog returned carrying something gently between his teeth. An old brass lantern covered in dust. Grant cleaned the glass. The wick was still intact. Mabel smiled when she saw it. Agnes used to hang that in the turret window so travelers knew someone was awake. That evening, Grant filled it with fresh oil. As sunset disappeared behind the mountains, he climbed the winding staircase. Atlas walked beside him. Grant placed the lantern in the third-floor window. A warm amber glow stretched across the valley below. Tiny, steady, impossible to miss. People driving along the mountain road slowed their trucks. Some looked up. Some smiled. No one called it haunted anymore. Late that night, a skinny teenage boy stood silently beyond the broken front gate. 16, maybe 17. Everything he owned fit inside one black trash bag. He stared at the glowing window, then at the old house, then turned as though ready to leave before anyone noticed. Atlas was already walking toward him slowly, carefully. No barking, no sudden movement. The shepherd stopped just within arm's reach, then quietly rested his head against the boy's trembling hand. The boy froze. Grant stepped onto the porch. He remembered another cold night, another lost soul, another open door. Neither of them spoke. Neither needed to. The lantern continued burning high above them, visible from anywhere in the valley. The boy kept one hand resting on Atlas's head, as though he expected the dog to disappear if he let go. He couldn't have been more than 16. His coat was too thin for a Wyoming spring night. The black trash bag hanging from his shoulder carried the unmistakable shape of everything he owned. Grant recognized it instantly. Combat had taught him to read body language. Homelessness had taught him to recognize exhaustion that went deeper than sleep. The boy's eyes never stopped searching. Windows, doors, treeing, escape routes. Grant knew that look. It belonged to people who had survived by expecting disappointment. "My name's Grant," he said quietly. The boy hesitated before answering. "Eli, you hungry?" Another pause. Finally, one small nod. Grant stepped aside from the doorway. Then, "Come inside." No promises, no speeches, just 4 simple words. Atlas turned first, walking slowly toward the warm kitchen without ever looking back. He somehow knew the boy would follow. He always did. The old kitchen no longer echoed. Fresh bread cooled on the counter. Coffee steamed beside a pot of venison stew Mabel had left earlier that afternoon. The cast-iron stove radiated steady warmth into every corner of the room. Eli stopped just inside the doorway. He didn't remove his coat. He didn't sit. He only looked around as though waiting for someone to tell him he had misunderstood. Grant filled a bowl, set it gently on the table. "It's hot," Take your time. Eli stared at the food for several seconds before picking up the spoon. The first bite disappeared almost too quickly. The second came slower. By the third, his shoulders lowered just enough to notice. Atlas lay beside the table, not begging, simply keeping watch. Grant smiled to himself. Some soldiers never really retired. The months that followed reshaped the house one quiet day at a time. Victor kept his promise. Licensed contractors finished the electrical system. New plumbing replaced every rusted pipe. The roof that Grant had first patched beneath falling snow now carried solid cedar shingles built to outlast another generation. Grant refused to let anyone touch the finish work. Old habits from woodworking returned naturally beneath his hands. Doors were planed until they closed with a gentle click. Window frames were sanded smooth enough for sunlight to find its way inside. Every repaired surface honored what had been there before, instead of pretending it had never broken. Atlas inspected every room after each day's work. The shepherds still limped slightly when mornings were cold. The injury never completely disappeared. Neither had Grant's damaged knee. Neither of them complained. Summer brought visitors, not tourists, not ghost hunters. People carrying old memories. Some came with faded photographs. Others carried letters. Several simply stood quietly beneath the turret window for a long time before saying anything. Grant reopened the hidden room, not as a secret, as a place of remembrance. Each family found its own box. Each child, now gay-haired adults, held forgotten pieces of lives they thought no one had remembered. Sometimes there were tears. Sometimes laughter. Usually both. Victor never entered unless invited. When he did, he always stopped before his mother's small keepsake box. One afternoon, Grant found him quietly replacing the worn shelf beneath it. "You could hire someone." Victor smiled faintly. "I know. I need to do this one myself." Grant understood. Some repairs belong to the hands carrying the regret. By autumn, the county approved a nonprofit charter. The name appeared on the paperwork exactly as Grant had hoped. Holloway Haven. No bronze statues, no grand dedication. No man's name above the entrance. Only a simple wooden sign, carved by Grant himself. Below the name, one line: "Keep the door open." Mabel became the unofficial grandmother of the house. She claimed she only cooked twice a week. Nobody believed her. Victor quietly funded maintenance and supplies. He refused every suggestion to rename a wing after him. "This place carried my family long before I ever carried it. That's enough." Grant accepted veterans, referred through local organizations. Young adults aging out of foster care arrived too. Not many. Just enough that every empty bedroom slowly found purpose again. No one was asked to explain their worst day, only whether they wanted breakfast. Atlas appointed himself the official welcome committee. Every newcomer received exactly the same greeting: a slow approach, patient eyes, one gentle nudge beneath a trembling hand. People trusted the dog before they trusted the house. Grant thought that made perfect sense. Trust had to begin somewhere. One evening, Eli wandered into Grant's workshop. The old Army veteran was restoring a broken oak chair. Wood shavings curled across the floor. The scent reminded Grant of the small repair shop his father had owned decades earlier. "You gonna throw that away?" Eli asked. Grant looked up. "The chair?" It looked beyond saving. Grant turned the chair over in his hands. "I've heard that before." He handed the teenager a block plane. "Every piece of wood tells you where it's still strong. You just have to slow down enough to listen." Eli took the tool awkwardly. Grant adjusted his grip. Not correcting, teaching. Atlas watched from the doorway, tail resting against the floor, quietly satisfied. The first snow returned exactly 1 year after Grant had walked into the county auction with $15 in his pocket. He climbed to the turret room just before sunset. The lantern waited beside the window. He trimmed the wick, filled the reservoir, lit the flame. Outside, the valley slowly disappeared beneath fresh snow. Far below, headlights wound through the mountain road. Some drivers glanced toward the hill. Every one of them could see the warm amber light. Grant rested one hand on the window frame. Atlas stood beside him. Older now, a little slower. Still watching, still faithful. Grant remembered sleeping inside an old pickup truck, with nowhere left to go. He remembered believing that buying a haunted house had simply meant finding shelter from another Wyoming winter. Instead, he had found a mission, not one assigned by the Army, not one written inside operational orders, one chosen, freely behind him. Laughter drifted upward from the kitchen. Mabel arguing over pie. Victor helping Eli stack firewood. Two veterans debating football beside the fireplace. Life. Ordinary life. The kind so many people spent years searching for without realizing it. Grant looked once more across the valley. The lantern reflected softly in the old glass. It no longer warned travelers away from haunted ground. It welcomed them home. Atlas leaned gently against Grant's leg. Grant rested his hand on the shepherd's scarred neck. Neither of them needed words. Some promises were stronger in silence. Outside, snow continued falling across the Wyoming mountains. Inside, the light remained steady. The door remained open, and somewhere beyond the dark tree line, someone who believed they had nowhere left to go might someday look up, notice a single warm light shining from the hill, and discover exactly what Agnes Holloway had hoped for all those years before. One safe night, then another, then a life rebuilt. If this story touched your heart, leave a 1 in the comments to let everyone know that kindness still matters. And if you've ever believed that one person or one loyal dog can change a life, leave a paw as well. I'd love to see how many of us are here together. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next story is already waiting, and it may remind you that hope often shows up when the world has stopped looking. Until next time. End of quoting. To the sisses, take care of the people who stand beside you, and never underestimate the quiet power of a door left.